Grace Odell drove a 14-year-old station wagon with a passenger door that only opened from the inside, and she'd learned to live with the small indignity of leaning across to let people out. Her son did it without thinking now. 8 years old, and he'd reach over, pop the handle, hold it while she came around, like it was a normal thing a boy did for his mother. Toby had a lot of habits like that, small kindnesses he'd taught himself because nobody had taught them to him. That morning she had a coin in her jacket pocket the way she'd had it for 6 years. Brass, worn smooth on one face, a bird stamped into it that had mostly rubbed away. It had belonged to her husband. It had been in his flight suit the day the trainer he was ferrying went down over the water off the coast, and it had come back to her in a plastic bag with his watch and his wedding ring and nothing else. And she had carried it every day since, because carrying it was the only argument she had left against the fact that he was gone. Toby knew not to ask about it. He knew the coin the way children know the shape of a locked door in a house they otherwise have the run of. He'd asked once when he was 5, and she'd started to answer and then hadn't been able to, and he'd watched her not be able to and had filed it away, and he never asked again. That was the kind of boy he was. He kept a careful inventory of the things that hurt his mother, and he steered around them the way you'd steer around potholes on a road you drove every day. They were at the airfield because Grace fixed things there. Not the planes, she wasn't rated for that, not anymore, though there'd been a life once where she might have been. She kept the ground equipment running. Tow tractors, the fuel Bowser's pumps, the auxiliary power units that coughed and died in the cold. Meridian Field was a small executive strip an hour north of the city, the kind of place where the tower closed at 9 and the coffee machine in the crew lounge had been broken since spring. And Grace was the person they called when a thing that was supposed to move stopped moving. She was good at it. She was cheap because she had to be, and she was better than the price suggested, which nobody seemed to notice was a strange combination. She noticed most things. That was rather the problem with her life, that she'd been built for a job that required her to see what other people missed, and then the job had been taken from her by grief, and the seeing hadn't gone anywhere. It just had nowhere to point anymore. So she pointed it at gearboxes and hydraulic lines and the particular sound a starter motor made in the second before it died, and she told herself that was enough, and on the good days she almost believed it. She'd brought Toby because it was a teacher training day, and there was nobody else. He sat in the corner of the maintenance shed with a book about deep-sea fish and a packet of crackers, and he was so quiet you could forget he was there, which was its own kind of sad if you thought about it too hard, so Grace tried not to. She'd set him up with an old car battery, a switch, and a torch bulb the week before, and he'd wired it himself, unprompted, and then sat looking at the little light he'd made with an expression she recognized because it was her own. She hadn't told him what that expression meant. She wasn't ready for him to want the sky. Look what the sky did. The shed smelled of grease and cold metal, and the instant coffee she made too strong. Rain had come through in the night, and the apron outside was still dark with it, the puddles holding a flat gray sky. It was a nothing sort of morning. That was worth remembering afterward, that it started as a completely nothing morning, the kind you'd never think to mark. The morning went the way mornings went, until a jet came in that shouldn't have been on the schedule. Grace knew the schedule. She always knew the schedule, because ground equipment had to be where the aircraft were, and there'd been nothing on the board for a heavy before noon. Then the radio in the shed crackled with a handling request she didn't recognize, priority repositioning, and 10 minutes later she heard it on approach, the particular smooth roar of a big cabin jet, expensive and unhurried, coming down out of the gray. It was a Gulfstream, cream and navy, the sort of aircraft that cost more than every house in the village where Grace rented her half of a semi. It taxied in fast and braked hard, harder than it needed to, the way a driver leans on a horn to tell you something about themselves. Before the air stairs were even down, there were people moving around it. A ground handler she didn't recognize, brought in from outside, which was odd. 2 men in suits, and then the man they were all orbiting, who came down the steps still talking into a phone and not looking at where his feet were going. His name was Warren Ashcroft. Grace didn't know that yet. She knew the type before she knew the name. The walk that assumed a path would clear itself, the watch worth more than the wagon, the way his eyes moved across the apron and priced everything and settled on nothing. She'd met 100 of him in the old life. She'd certified aircraft for men like him, and she'd learned early that they came in 2 kinds. The ones who understood that the paperwork she carried was the only thing standing between them and the ground, and the ones who thought the paperwork was an obstacle she'd invented to feel important. The second kind signed her name in their heads before she'd finished the inspection. This one had that walk. The outside handler had parked the tow tractor badly. Her tractor, the one she'd spent the morning on, nosed in at an angle that blocked the fuel point, and Grace had gone out to move it and found the coupling seized again. And so she was crouched at its rear with her sleeves pushed up and greased to the elbow when Ashcroft crossed the apron toward the terminal. What actually happened was small. That was the thing about it. Later, when people told the story, they made it bigger, but it was small. He clipped the toe of his shoe against the toolbox she'd set down on the wet concrete. Something spilled her things. A socket set, a torque wrench, and the coin, which she'd taken out of her pocket while she worked because the jacket was on the ground, and she liked to know where it was. She always took it out when she worked. She didn't like the idea of it in a pocket where it might fall into an engine bay or a drain and be gone. She'd rather have it in her sight. There was probably something in that about the shape of grief, but Grace didn't examine it. She just always took it out and set it where she could see it. The coin skittered across the concrete and stopped near his foot. He looked down at it. He picked it up. She would give him that. He bent and picked it up, and for half a second she thought he was going to be decent about it. He turned it in his fingers, and she saw him register that it was old, worn, valueless by any measure he understood. "What's this?" he said, not really a question. "This is garbage. You people leave junk all over the ramp." He said "you people" the way some men said it, meaning everyone who worked with their hands, everyone who was where he was standing for a reason other than owning it. He looked at the worn bird, the smooth face, and his mouth did something dismissive. "You want to lose an engine to a bit of loose metal like this. FOD, they call it. Foreign object debris. You people ever hear of it? Learn to keep your area clean." The FOD line landed somewhere under her ribs, because of course she'd heard of it, because she had written FOD walk procedures that men like him had signed, because foreign object debris was a phrase she'd used in a report the week before a coroner used the words catastrophic in-flight failure about her husband. He didn't know any of that. He was just a man reaching for the most technical-sounding thing. He had to make a woman in overalls feel small. And then he flipped it, not hard. A little contemptuous toss, the way you'd get rid of a bottle cap, and it went spinning off toward the storm grate at the edge of the apron. Grace was up and moving before she made the decision to move. She got a knee down on the wet concrete, felt the cold of the puddle soak straight through her overalls, and caught it with 2 fingers half over the grate's lip, the coin already tilting into the dark, and when she stood up her hands were shaking and her voice was not. "Don't," she said, "don't touch that again." He was already walking. He half turned, mildly surprised that the equipment had spoken. "Excuse me. It's not yours to throw. It's a bit of scrap." He was enjoying it now a little. The suits behind him had stopped, sensing entertainment. "You're very attached to your scrap." "It was my husband's." She hadn't meant to say it. It came out flat and it landed flat, and for a moment something moved across the man's face, not shame. She would think later, but the recognition that he'd stepped into something he couldn't price, which for a man like that was almost the same as fear. Then it closed over. "Well," he said, "sentiment's expensive." He glanced at his watch, the gesture of a man reminding a room that his time cost money. "Keep your junk off my ramp." And he went inside and the door hissed shut behind him, and that was all of it. That was the entire thing. It took 90 seconds. Grace stood there with the coin closed in her fist and her son watching her through the shed's grimy window, and she made herself breathe until her hand stopped. She was aware of Toby's face at the glass, small and still and reading her the way he read everything, and she straightened her back and made her shoulders come down and gave him a look across the apron that said, "I'm fine. It's fine," because the last thing she wanted was for her son to learn at 8 that the world would do this to his mother, and she couldn't stop it. Then she went back to the tractor, because the coupling still didn't work and self-respect didn't fix couplings. Toby came out anyway. He crossed the apron in his too big coat and stood next to her while she worked, not saying anything for a while, which was his way. "Who was that man?" he said eventually. "Nobody, a customer." "He threw your coin." "He did." Toby considered this with the gravity he brought to everything. "Why didn't you shout at him?" Grace paused with the wrench in her hand. It was a fair question. It was, in fact, the question. Because shouting doesn't fix things, she said, and then, because she'd promised herself a long time ago that she wouldn't lie to him even in the small ways, she added. "And because he's rich and I'm not, and if I'd shouted, the only person who'd have had a bad day is me. That's not fair, but it's true. Sometimes the fair thing and the true thing aren't the same, and you have to know which one you're standing in." Toby filed that away. She could see him file it. "I'd have shouted," he said loyally. "I know you would." She reached over and pulled his hood up against the drizzle. "That's because you're braver than me." "You're not brave," he said, in the careful double negative way of a boy working something out. "You just do it quiet." She had to look back at the coupling for a second after that. She thought it was over. It should have been over. A rich man had been unkind to her for a minute and a half. That was Tuesday, that was every Tuesday, and you didn't build anything by keeping the receipts. But here is what Warren Ashcroft did not know, standing on that apron, tossing a dead man's coin toward a drain. He did not know whose airfield he'd flown into. Not the name over the gate, that was a holding company. Meridian was owned by a name nobody photographed. An old man called Edmund Rourke who'd made his money in freight and spent his retirement quietly owning small, useful things. Ashcroft didn't know that the whole reason he was there was a deal. A big one. The kind that gets a Gulfstream repositioned overnight. Ashcroft's charter group was buying a fleet, 11 aircraft, financing arranged, and one of the last conditions was a technical acceptance survey signed off by an independent airworthiness inspector before the money moved. $2 billion, near enough, hung on that signature. And he did not know, because why would he look? Why would a man like that ever look? That the woman he'd told to keep her junk off his ramp had been that inspector, once. That before the crash, before the widow and the wagon and the broken door, Grace Odell had been one of the youngest designated airworthiness representatives in the country. That she had walked away from it when her husband died because she could not stand to sign her name to the sky anymore, and that the certificate had lapsed, but the mind that earned it had not. He did not know that Edmund Rourke had flown with a young pilot named Daniel Odell 30 years before, in another service, in another life, and that when the news came about the trainer going into the water off the coast, the old man had sat alone in his office for a long time and then made 2 phone calls. The first was to send flowers. The second was to make sure that Daniel's widow, a brilliant woman he'd heard, wasted on her grief, would always have work at his field if she wanted it. No charity, nothing she could refuse out of pride, just work whenever she came at whatever she could bear to do. Rourke had never told her this. He was not a man who took credit. She thought she got the job because she was good and cheap. She had. She'd also got it because an old man couldn't stand to do nothing, and had done the one quiet thing in his power. He didn't know any of that. He went inside to close his deal. The inspector who was supposed to sign the acceptance survey was named Peter Vance, and he arrived at 11, and by 1:30, he was standing in the maintenance shed drinking Grace's terrible coffee, because he'd known her a long time and the crew lounge machine was still broken. He was a big, tired man, near retirement, with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, and the particular weary carefulness of someone who'd spent 40 years being pressured to sign things quickly and had, mostly, held the line, and had the enemies to prove it. He'd known Grace in the old life. He'd been one of the people who checked her early inspections when she was the young prodigy everyone was watching, and he'd been at the funeral, and he was one of the few who'd never once suggested she should get back to it. Come on, waste of a mind, because he understood better than most exactly what she'd have to sign her name to and exactly why she couldn't. Big day for the money men, he said. 11 tails. Ashcroft's people have been pushing the timeline like it's on fire. I've had the buyer's lawyer on the phone twice this morning telling me my survey's a formality. He said formality the way you'd say a swear word. Grace was reassembling the coupling. I met Mr. Ashcroft. Something in how she said it made Peter look up over the glasses. Did you? He waited. When she didn't go on, he didn't push. Instead, he turned his cup in his hands and looked into it, and when he spoke his voice had dropped into a register she remembered, the one he used when he was about to tell you something he shouldn't. I'll tell you something and you can do what you like with it, he said. I don't like these airframes. Not all of them, most are clean, ordinary lease returns, but 3 of the 11 have come through a leaseback chain I can't get straight paper on. There's a records gap on 2 of them, a whole block of maintenance entries that reference a shop that doesn't exist anymore, and the continuity's been reconstructed after the fact. Clean typeface. Consistent. Too consistent. Real logbooks are a mess, Grace, you know that. They've got coffee rings and 3 different pens and a mechanic's bad handwriting. These read like someone wrote them all in an afternoon. He grimaced. It smells. And I've got a room full of very expensive men telling me I'm being difficult and a boss who wants the fee, and I'm 63, and my pension's a phone call away from being someone else's decision. Grace set down the wrench. How reconstructed, she said. He told her, and the mind that had lapsed but not left woke all the way up. What Peter described was a laundered logbook, aircraft that had likely been in an incident, or had run past a critical inspection interval, papered over by inventing a clean history and backfilling it against a maintenance facility that had conveniently closed, so that no one could call the shop and ask. It was the kind of fraud that worked precisely because checking it was tedious, and everyone was in a hurry, and the men in the suits were very sure of themselves. It was the kind of fraud that put people in the air over water in aircraft that shouldn't be there. It was, when you stripped the paper off it, the exact machine that had killed her husband. Not this deal, not these men, but the shape of it, the willingness to let a thing fly that someone knew shouldn't, because the money was already moving and stopping it was inconvenient. Grace knew exactly what that looked like. She had spent 6 years not thinking about what it looked like. She realized her hand had gone to her jacket pocket, to the hard, familiar weight of the coin, without her telling it to. Show me the 2 with the gap, she said. Peter hesitated. You're not current. I'm not going to sign anything. You are. I'm going to tell you what to look at. If Rourke's office hears, I let a lapsed inspector onto the aircraft during an acceptance survey. Then don't tell them until you've got something worth telling them. She was already pulling off her gloves, reaching for the clean ones. Peter, you came in here and drank my terrible coffee and told me it smells. You didn't have to do that. You could have signed it and gone home and let it be someone else's name in 10 years. She looked at him steadily. You came in here because you didn't want to be the man who signed it. I'm offering to help you not be that man. Now show me the aircraft. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in him, the part that had held the line for 40 years, that was tired but not gone, gave way to the part that had walked into her shed on purpose. Bring your torch, he said, the good one. They went out to the ramp together, an old inspector and a woman in greasy overalls, and Toby was left with strict instructions and a fresh packet of crackers, and the promise that this was important and quiet important, both, and he nodded like a soldier receiving orders. They started with the paperwork, spread on the wing of the first aircraft under the gray light, and Grace read it the way she'd once read 100 others, not front to back, but the way you read a face for a lie, looking for the place where the story got too smooth. She found the seam in 20 minutes. A tail number in the continuity records that didn't match the data plate riveted to the airframe by 2 digits, the kind of error that happens when you're transcribing a history you're inventing rather than recording one you lived. Small. Fatal. She put her finger on it and Peter went very still. Then they opened panels the acceptance survey wasn't required to open, and Grace put her hands on the aircraft. There is a thing that happens with people who are properly good at a physical, technical craft, and it doesn't photograph and it doesn't explain well, but it's real. The hands know before the mind does. Grace ran her palm along the inside of a pressure bulkhead, down where no buyer ever looked, and stopped and went back and pressed. A repair patch. A doubler, a reinforcing plate bonded over a section of the bulkhead and painted to match, painted, crucially, to look older than the surrounding metal, aged on purpose, which is a thing you only do if you need a repair to seem like it's always been there. And no logbook, real or fake, mentioned a bulkhead repair on this airframe at all. Peter, her voice had changed. He heard it change. Come here, get your hand on this. He did. He found the edge of the doubler with his thumb, the way she had, and she watched 40 years of experience arrive at the same place her instinct had, and watched his face fall. That's structural, he said quietly. That's a major repair, pressure vessel. That doesn't happen unless something hurt it badly, Grace finished. Hard landing, overstress, something that cracked the airframe badly enough to need a structural repair to the pressure cabin, and someone spent a great deal of money making the repair invisible and keeping it out of the books, which means whoever's selling this knows exactly what happened to it and decided the buyers didn't need to. She stepped back and looked up the great cream flank of the thing. It'll fly fine. It'll fly fine for years. And then one day at altitude it won't, and it'll be quick, and everyone will wonder how a clean history aircraft came apart, and the answer will be that it was never clean and a room full of people in suits knew and signed anyway. They stood in the aircraft's shadow, the two of them in the cold. If you sign this, Grace said, and one of these comes apart in 10 years, it's your name, not theirs, yours. They'll have moved the money and moved on, and the paper trail that ends at a signature will end at yours. Peter looked like a man who had just been shown the edge of a hole he'd nearly stepped into in the dark. I need the records, he said, the real ones. If I refuse without proof, they'll just find someone who'll sign, and they'll bury me for the fee. They'll say I'm difficult, past it, sabotaging a deal out of spite. Rourke won't back a fight he can't see the bottom of. I need to be able to put the true history on the table next to the fake one. Otherwise, it's my word that it smells, against a stack of very expensive paper that says it doesn't. And here the coin came back into it, though not the way anyone would have written it. Because Grace knew where the real records were. The defunct shop the fraud referenced, she knew it, had known the man who ran it. An old airframe engineer named Saul Brennan, who'd done honest work out of a leased hangar 2 fields over until his knees and his eyes gave out, and the lease got expensive, and the business quietly folded. And Saul wasn't dead. Saul was in a care home 40 minutes away, and on his good days he was sharp as a new rivet, and Saul was the sort of man who had never thrown a logbook away in his life, who kept the true history of every aircraft that came through his hangar in fireproof boxes, because that, to Saul, was the whole point of the job. Not the fixing, the recording, the honest, unbroken line of what had really been done. And Grace knew this, knew Saul specifically, out of all the engineers in the country, because Saul Brennan had been at Daniel's funeral, had pressed her hand in the gray churchyard and told her, quietly, so the others wouldn't hear, that he'd known her husband, had worked on aircraft Danny flew, and that she should know something they might not put in the eulogy. That a few years back Danny had brought a failing aircraft down onto a short wet strip so gently, with a dead engine and a jammed surface, that 4 people had walked away from something that by rights should have killed all of them. He flew it like he was setting down a sleeping child, Saul had said. I saw the airframe after. He asked more of it than it had, and it gave because he asked it kindly. And then Saul had nodded at the coin she was turning over and over in her fingers, the coin she'd taken from the plastic bag, and said, "There's a kestrel on that, isn't there? His squadron's mark. Small bird. Everyone underestimates it. Sees everything, misses nothing." Suited him. And that had been the only new thing anyone had told her about Daniel in the whole of that gray year. The kestrel, the sleeping child, the 4 who walked away, and she had held onto Saul for it the way she held onto the coin. She'd kept the coin. She'd also, without quite deciding to, kept Saul, Christmas cards, the odd visit, a box of decent biscuits every few months to a man whose family didn't come. She drove out to see him that afternoon. Told Peter to sit tight and photograph everything and touch nothing and say nothing to the suits. Let them think you're just being slow. And she loaded Toby into the wagon with his fish book, and she drove the 40 minutes to the care home with her heart going harder than the errand warranted, because it wasn't only an errand. Saul was in the day room by the window, smaller than the last time, a blanket over his knees, and when he saw her his whole face reorganized itself into something young. "Gracie Odell," he said, "and a small first officer." He looked at Toby with real delight. "You'll be Daniel's boy. You've got his ears, God help you." Toby, who did not usually take to strangers, took to Saul immediately, the way children can tell. She let Toby get settled with a comic and aid found, and then she pulled a chair close and told the old man why she'd come. 3 tail numbers, a hard landing, a repair that vanished, and she watched his face change, watched him go from delight to something older and harder, the face of a craftsman who's been waiting a long time for a particular knock at the door. "I wondered," Saul said. His hands were unsteady on the blanket now, but his eyes weren't. "I've wondered for 11 years when someone would come and ask about those." He looked out the window for a moment. "I did the repair. On one of them. Genuine major structural after a heavy landing that cracked the aft pressure bulkhead. A training captain put it down hard in a crosswind, no one hurt, but the airframe took it badly. I fixed it properly, did it right, documented it right, every hour of it in the book because that's the job." His mouth tightened. "And then the owner's people came and told me to lose the records, said the aircraft would sell for a fortune more with a clean history, offered me money. Then when I said no, threatened the business." He looked at her. "I said I don't lose things. Losing things is the one thing an engineer must never do, so they took the business instead. Put it about that I was unreliable, difficult past it. Same words they'll be using about your Mr. Vance by tomorrow, I'd bet. It's a small vocabulary, that lot." He almost smiled. "But I kept the books, every page. Fireproof box, and a copy with my solicitor, because I'm old and I've been threatened by better men than them." "Saul," Grace's voice wasn't quite steady, "if you give me those, they're going to know it was you. It'll be a fight. At my age," Saul finished gently, "the only thing I've got left to spend is the truth I've been sitting on, and I'd rather spend it than take it with me." He reached over and put his papery hand over hers, over the hand that was, without her noticing, around the coin in her pocket again. Danny would have asked. "That's the thing I keep coming back to. Out of everyone who ever knew about those aircraft, your husband is the one who'd have got on a plane, a train, whatever it took, and knocked on my door and said, 'Saul, tell me the truth about these because people are going to fly in them.' He'd have asked. Nobody else did." His eyes were wet now and unashamed of it. "You asked. You've got his habit of asking. Get me a pen, love, and tell me where to send the box." Grace brought the real records back to the field as the light was going. She did not hand them to Ashcroft's men. She did not walk into a boardroom and slam a folder on a table. That wasn't the shape of her, and it wasn't the shape of the thing. What she did was quieter and much worse for the people it happened to. She gave the real records to Peter, and she sat with him in the maintenance shed, Toby asleep now in the corner under her jacket. The coin moved to her breast pocket so it would be near him, and they laid the true history beside the laundered one, page against page, under the fluorescent light. Saul's honest, coffee-ringed, 3-pens-end bad handwriting record of a major structural repair to an aft pressure bulkhead, dated, signed, photographed. And beside it, the buyer's clean, consistent, too smooth reconstruction that swore the aircraft had never been touched. The two documents could not both be true. One of them was a forgery, and the forgery was the one the men in suits were about to move £2 billion on. The fraud came apart on that workbench in the small hours, with a boy asleep in the corner and rain starting again on the shed roof. Then Peter did the thing he was actually paid to do, which was refuse to sign. And he did it properly in writing, with the photographs and Saul's records attached. And he copied it not just to Rourke's office, but to the Aviation Authority's Airworthiness Division, because a reconstructed logbook backfilled against a shop deliberately made to disappear wasn't just a bad deal or a difficult inspector's opinion. It was a criminal falsification of aircraft safety records. And the moment a regulator had the real documents, the £2 billion purchase wasn't the story anymore. The story was who forged the paper, and who ordered it forged, and how many of the 11 aircraft, or the 100 before them, were already out there flying with invented histories, over water, full of people who'd been told they were safe. Warren Ashcroft found out that his deal was dead at 6 the following evening in the crew lounge from a lawyer on the phone. Grace happened to be walking past the window with her toolbox, Toby's hand in hers, on their way out at the end of a long day. She wasn't gloating. She'd have told you honestly she wasn't. But she looked in through the glass, and she saw the man's face as it happened, the phone against his ear, the color going out of him, the same flat recognition he'd worn for half a second on the apron when she said it was my husband's, the look of a man stepping into something he could not price and could not buy his way back out of. The suits around him were very still. She kept walking, because the tractor was fixed and the day was over and her son was waiting to lean across and hold the broken door. Ashcroft came out to the car park as she was loading her tools. She thought for a moment he'd come to shout or to threaten, and she felt Toby go still beside her and put herself a half step in front of him without thinking. But Ashcroft didn't shout. He stood a few feet away with his hands in his pockets and none of the morning certainty on him, a smaller man than the one who'd come down the air stairs, as if the last 24 hours had let some of the air out. "They're saying it was the records," he said. "That someone produced the original books, the true history of the airframes. Someone who knew exactly where to look and exactly what a bonded doubler under a coat of aged paint meant." He studied her, and she watched him arrive slowly at the thing he should have seen the second she caught the coin over the drain. "That was you." "That was an inspector doing his job," Grace said. "I just fix tractors." "No," he shook his head slowly. "No, I don't think you do. I think—" He stopped, started again. "I've been on the phone all day. My own people didn't tell me about the bulkhead. My own people knew and structured the deal so I wouldn't, so I'd have deniability." A short, bitter breath. "They protected me from the truth, and it nearly cost me £2 billion, and God knows what if one of them had come apart with my name on the certificate. And the only person on this entire airfield who told the truth about any of it was the woman I—" He couldn't say it. Men like him rarely had practice with the end of that sentence. "The woman you told to keep her junk off your ramp," Grace said, not cruelly, just finishing it for him because someone had to. He took his hand out of his pocket. She tensed, and then saw it was nothing. He just needed to do something with his hands. "This morning," he said. "Yesterday morning, the coin. He looked at Toby, then back at her. "I'm not going to insult you by trying to make that all right. I don't think I can, but I'd like to know what it was, what I threw." Grace considered him for a moment. Then she took the coin out of her breast pocket and held it up in the last of the light, the worn bird catching what there was of it. "It has a kestrel on it," she said. "My husband flew with a kestrel on his squadron patch, a small bird. You'd look at it and think it wasn't much." She turned it in her fingers the way Saul had, the way she'd done 10,000 times. He was a pilot. He put a failing aircraft down once so gently with a dead engine and a jammed control that 4 people walked away who by rights shouldn't have. He asked more of that airframe than it had, and it gave because he asked it kindly. That's the kind of man he was. She closed her hand around the coin. He went into the water off the coast 6 years ago in a trainer someone should have grounded and didn't, because stopping it was inconvenient and the aircraft was already scheduled to fly. This came back in a bag with his ring. It's the only thing of that day I have. And that's what you picked up off the ground and called garbage and threw at a drain." Ashcroft was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere behind him, the lights of the crew lounge burned, and the very expensive men inside were still finding out how much trouble they were in. "I didn't know," he said finally. "It came out low." "No," Grace agreed. "You didn't look." She said it without heat now, almost gently, because it was true and the truth didn't need heat. "That's the whole thing, Mr. Ashcroft. That's the entire thing, start to finish. You didn't look at the coin, and you didn't look at me, and your own people counted on you not looking at the aircraft. It's all the same habit. It's the most expensive habit a person can have, and nobody ever tells the rich they've got it, because the rich are the last people the truth ever reaches." She opened the wagon's driver door. "Someone should tell your people that, about the aircraft, not for your sake, for whoever'd have been sitting in them." "I'm going to burn them down," Ashcroft said, and there was something new in his voice, not the arrogance, something colder and more useful. "The people who structured that deal, every one of them who knew, I'm going to spend real money making sure they never do this to anyone again." He looked at her almost helplessly. "Is there anything?" "There's a man called Saul Brennan," Grace said. "He kept honest records for 11 years, and it cost him his business and his name, and he gave them to me yesterday because he'd rather spend the truth than take it with him. He's in a care home his family doesn't visit. If you want to do something with all that money and all that shame, go and find out what a man like that needed, 11 years too late, and see that the next Saul Brennan doesn't lose everything for refusing to lose things." She got into the car. "That'd be worth more than an apology to me. Apologies are cheap. You said so yourself. Sentiment's expensive." She pulled the door shut. Toby reached across from the passenger seat and popped his own door and held it, the way he did, and Grace thought, not for the first time, that her 8-year-old son had learned more about how to be a person than the man standing in the car park had managed in 50 years. She started the engine. Ashcroft was still standing there as she pulled out, a wealthy man alone in a car park in the dark, holding nothing, having finally been made to look at something. Behind him, in a lounge with a broken coffee machine, the men who'd built the deal were beginning to understand that the cheapest-looking person on the ramp had been the only one telling the truth the whole time. And that they had thrown her away, exactly the way you'd throw away a bit of scrap metal, without ever once thinking to check what she was worth. Grace drove her son home. She didn't tell him about the 2 billion pounds, or the bulkhead, or the regulator, or the men whose careers had ended that day, because a woman bent down and picked something up off the ground. She told him they'd fixed the tractor, which was true, and that they'd helped an old friend of his dad's do a right thing, which was also true, and that the old friend had a good story about a kestrel. "What's a kestrel again?" Toby asked, though she knew he remembered. "A small bird," Grace said. "Not big. You'd look at it and think it wasn't much." She checked her mirror, pulled onto the dark road. "But it can see a mouse move in a field from 200 feet up. Everything else looks and sees a field. The kestrel sees the mouse." She reached over and squeezed his knee. "It just watches, quiet, and when it's sure, and then nothing gets away from it." "Like you," Toby said. "You do it quiet." Grace didn't answer that for a second, because her throat had done something. "Like your dad," she said finally, "I learned it off him." Toby thought about that the way he thought about everything, seriously, all the way home, his father's ears catching the passing streetlights. And in Grace's breast pocket the coin lay quiet against a long day's honest work, a small worn thing that a rich man had called garbage, that had been to the bottom of the sea and back in a dead man's flight suit, that had a kestrel on it because a good pilot flew with kestrels. And that had, in the end, when it finally reached the one person on the whole airfield who bent down and looked, been worth exactly £2 billion.